Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Nemeth Report podcast. I'm Dr. Tammy Nemeth, and today I am talking to a fellow podcast partner, Mr. David Blackmon. Hello, David. How are you today?
Well, good morning. I'm great. I love that intro there. It's very cool.
Oh, thanks. I like all the little flashing things and
Yeah.
showing about energy and stuff, which is always really fun.
Yeah. Well, I
So,
mean, we have to try to be flashy, right? You're talking about energy. Everything's flashy in the energy industry.
absolutely. So, for people who haven't tuned in before or tuning in for the first time, or it's been a while, can you just take a moment to introduce yourself? Tell us who you
Sure.
are, what you do, and whatnot.
Yeah. So I'm David Blackmon. I was in the oil and gas business for a long time, 40 years. Semi-retired a few years ago, and now I just write and talk about energy. It's been my livelihood for forever, my entire adult life, and mostly in the oil and gas business. I write at Forbes, I write at the Daily Caller, some trade magazines, and have my own Substack at blackman.substack.com, and would love to see folks come see me there.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I love your posts every day and how you went from energy absurdities to energy addition,
Yeah,
since that is really what we're doing.
that is what we're doing. We're not doing any it was energy transition absurdities. I don't know why I decided to put the word transition in there to begin with because I've always been skeptical that this was going to be any kind of a real transition. And, I think about 2 years ago, pretty much everyone who knows anything about it finally realized that there's not really a transition happening, and all we're doing is adding more capacity and trying to keep up with demand now, and that's really all it is.
That's so true, and we've had so many conversations about this, and, David and I joined 2 other people on Mondays, every Monday, except last Monday because it was a holiday,
Yes.
where we talk about the different energy realities issues, and, it's been really fascinating to see this transition in rhetoric that's been happening, particularly with the renewed Trump administration,
Yeah.
because when Biden was there, we were still talking about we're going to do the transition. There was the Inflation Reduction Act, and there were all these subsidies and whatnot that just went across the board, and lots of EPA restrictions on different emissions, different energy use for appliances and whatnot. And then Trump comes back, and the narrative shifted again. And I think not just the narrative, if you could maybe just share a little bit about, the actual stuff that's happening in the United States
Yeah.
that's reflecting more of the reality than the transition.
Yeah, of course the narrative did shift, and because people could see what the Trump administration was about to be doing related to basically dismantling the energy and climate policies of the Obama and Biden administrations. They've gone a long way to getting that entire job done now, and not just from a regulatory standpoint and legislative standpoint, but also knocking down the two main pillars in US law that served as the foundation for all of that climate agenda beginning in 2009 in the first year of the Obama administration. You had the EPA's endangerment finding on greenhouse gases, which never should have been an aspect of the law, but had a bad Supreme Court 5-4 Supreme Court decision underpinning it that the EPA put in place in 2010, which allowed the Obama administration to just basically go crazy in its efforts to kill coal and then to start moving on natural gas and oil as well later in his second term. And then you also had the second big pillar, which was the Chevron deference, this principle of the judiciary that ordered judges, federal judges, said they had to defer to the judgment of the regulators on matters of interpreting our major environmental statutes, like the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act and the Endangered Species Act and all these big, major pieces of legislation, climate environmental protection legislation that came into place in the 1970s that really have gone a long way to cleaning up the air and water in our country and protecting a lot of important species like bald eagles and grizzly bears and gray wolves. But now, of course, eventually came to be systematically abused by the left-wing environmental organizations, activists, and had really kind of been expanded grossly beyond their original intent by the regulatory agencies. So you did away with the Chevron deference in a case called Loper Bright v. Raimondo in 2024, in the summer of 2024, and you rescinded the endangerment finding at the EPA late last year. And so now there's not really any legal underpinnings for any of those major regulatory actions that were taken by Obama and Biden. And it's a lot easier to go about rescinding those and rewriting them. And so this is the most major shift in energy policy and climate policy the United States has ever seen. And it's going largely unreported in the mainstream media. They're just so busy doing other stuff that they're not really focusing on it. But, it's just changing the world in the United States. And by doing that, it's also impeding this massive expansion of wind and solar power and batteries. Now that the incentives under the Inflation Reduction Act have also been repealed. And, we've had a lot of growth in solar, particularly over the last year, but that's all about to come to an end in July when the incentive, the subsidy goes away, the IRA subsidy, and for any projects that haven't begun. And so that's going to come to a big slowdown, and we're going to have a reorganization of our entire energy structure over the next several years. And that's bound to have an impact in the rest of the world because U.S. economy is so huge. So it's all, it's all very impactful, and it's caused these activist groups to have to go find more fertile ground for their operations.
Yes, and it's interesting that there's been this pivot towards the climate activists going after the next big thing, because what the climate activists are really concerned about is having reliable energy that's produced from hydrocarbons and nuclear to some extent.
Right.
And if you need that reliable power for something that is ostensibly crucial for the economy, and right now that's being pitched as the data centers, then now they've pivoted to attacking the data centers, because if you have the data centers, then you need the reliable energy, which would enable the oil and gas, especially natural gas power, to not be sort of protested against the way that they did with fracking. And you and I have written an article about this. It'll be coming out this week, where we talk about the parallels and the similarities and a lot of the same actors who financed and organized the protests against fracking, against the oil sands, against the different pipelines like the Keystone XL pipeline. And I'm wondering if you could just kind of share your experiences having gone through that whole activist-driven attacks against the fracking industry. What do you make of these current protests against the data centers?
Well, it is an instant replay. I mean, it's really kind of spooky. A good friend of mine named Steve Everly and I have really been talking about it over the past couple of weeks. It as this thing is just really snowballed, really just in the month of May, from something you didn't really notice much to something that's really pervasive now throughout all of our media here in the United States, and that is this pushback on data centers. And there are plenty of reasons to be concerned about data centers, and so I don't really question the local people who are concerned about their water supply and concerned about their air, concerned about noise issues, concerned about these enormous projects, being put on arable farmland, which I have a big problem with personally, frankly, and wind farm, with wind farms and solar arrays, not just AI data centers. And so there's a lot of good reasons to be concerned about these things. And the AI industry, the tech companies, I think really just until the last few weeks completely underestimated the scale of the problem they were about to incur here. As these activist groups led by a billionaire named Neville Singham, apparently, and Arabella advisors, both of which are currently under investigation by the U.S. Department of Justice, by the way, but are pouring hundreds of millions of dollars now into opposition to data centers because they view it as fertile ground for their NGOs to raise money. And we saw the same thing happen to hydraulic fracturing starting about 20 years ago in the oil and gas industry during the shale revolution, as that really became widespread across all these enormous shale plays in the country. And it's the same group of NGOs, billionaire funded foundations, and environmentalist, quote, environmentalist organizations like the Sierra Club and Wild Earth Guardians and the NRDC. It's all the same acronyms and even the same talking points, even exact same messaging that we saw be deployed against hydraulic fracturing. And it took us a while in the oil industry. Really, it took a couple of years before we really got adequately organized and really, hard to understand the scale of the pushback and how to intelligently address it. And these AI companies, I think now are just only now trying to really get their arms around all of this. And they're behind the curve, and it's going to take them a while to catch up. And so what we're going to see is a whole bunch of proposed data centers. Many have already been killed by local governments, and a lot more are going to be killed here in the coming months.
Yeah, well, our friend Robert Bryce has been keeping track of all of these data center closures and the opposition towards them and whatnot. And, you raise a really great point that, there's genuine local concerns and they absolutely deserve attention. But it's like with the oil sands and with the pipelines and with fracking, these legitimate concerns, local issues, are being exploited and exaggerated. And the activists use this old fear playbook is how I like to call it, because it's like, oh, yeah, there's a little thing about water. Well, let me exaggerate what that claim is. You think it's going to be more expensive? Well, let me exaggerate and just leave out key information and stuff. And I think Kristen Walker, she wrote a really good piece identifying the evidence that actually in many cases where data centers are put up, residential rates decrease because they're bringing their own power, or maybe they're paying for additional power on the grid and whatnot. And a lot of the places, where in the eastern states and in the blue states where there is a lot of population, where they require probably a lot of the data centers, they have miserable, terrible energy policies. And then, people are already having to pay quite a lot for their power because it's unreliable, because they won't allow hydrocarbons or for whatever reasons. And then the data centers come in and are like, well, we'll build this, we'll build that, but it flies against the net zero policies. And then, all this stuff kind of gets rage baited. And
so this is why what you just talked about there is why so in the United States, the two major areas for data center build out have been the state of Virginia and the state of Texas.
Yeah.
And we're about to see the state of Virginia, the growth in that industry there, stop because they elected the wrong governor, and she's going to crowd it all out. Okay. And when I say wrong, they elected an anti-business governor. And so all their energy policies now that attracted the AI data centers to their state and created thousands and thousands of jobs and billions of dollars of economic impact is now going to stop because she's going to kill it. Texas is going to become even more of a focal area for the industry. And we're going to see, and we're already seeing, these activist groups come into Texas now and try to organize communities against additional data centers being built here. And so that's how this all works. You know, they identify the hot spots, and they, I mean, these billionaires pour millions and millions of dollars. This is not a few $1,000s here and there. This is big time money. And of course, Kevin O'Leary now says he's tracing some of this money back to China, of course, which has a big interest in killing our AI industry here in the United States because they're our main competitor.
Yeah.
And so this is really insidious, and it's a major issue. And what I could worry about is these local communities, the people who really do have legitimate concerns, getting crowded now completely out of the conversation.
Yeah.
Because what we saw in the oil and gas business is that once these activists get into your community, what they start doing is picking off local residents to parrot their talking points, and they pay the locals, willing local people, money to show up at county commission meetings, whatever it is, and just memorize their scripts and repeat them to the policymakers and try to influence the commissioner's court to deny permits for good projects. And so the real people with real concerns end up getting crowded completely out of the entire debate. And there's no more grassroots. It's strictly industry over here on one side with one set of scripted messages, and the activists over here on the other side with their astroturf messages. And there's no in between anymore. And the commissioners, the ones who aren't paid off by the activists, are they're kind of left without any real input from real people. And it's a really unhealthy situation for these communities where real impacts are going to be felt by these big projects. And it's a shame that it's allowed to persist here in the United States, but it's just the way our laws are structured and what we allow from these billionaire foundations to fund through these dark money 501c3 NGOs. And until those laws are changed or repealed, this kind of thing is only going to continue as additional technologies come up for development. They're always going to go after whatever new industry it is that they believe they can frighten the public into pouring more money into their NGOs. And so it's all about the money.
I think that's a big part of it, but I think that the China angle is significant, especially those who want to see America be no longer the great power in the world. So if you undermine America's reliable energy, if you undermine their oil production, their natural gas production, their coal, and they've done a really good job against coal, if you undermine nuclear, then where does that leave America? Because energy security, as Stu likes to say on the Energy Realities podcast, is national security. So if you don't have reliable energy, then you become minimized in the global community. Look at Europe. Look at the UK. They don't have reliable energy of their own. They're in a mess. What's the state of their militaries? What's the state of their ability to project power in the world? And so who benefits from undermining America's energy production and now undermining the data centers and AI? Well, it's China.
It's China. Every time.
It's China. I hate to say that to some extent because there's a lot of people out there who don't want to believe it, who don't want to see it as a threat. China's looking after its best interest. Okay, what's its best interest? To undermine the United States and remove it, its ability to project power. And this is a really big way to do it. And I believe that the sort of progressives, the international progressives, and that includes the Center for American Progress, that includes the Labour parties in Australia, the UK, the progressives in the European Union, they all support that. They don't want America to be the big power in the world or to be able to project their power. And they all support that. one of the things that we include in our article is the reference to John Podesta, who was at this progressive conference in Toronto in Canada, where there's a sister organization in Canada called Canada 2020, and it was run by Mark Carney until he became prime minister. So he was at this conference talking about how maybe Canada can be the example in the world of how progressives can win the narrative. But one of the things he said was how if data centers are allow the expansion of hydrocarbon energy, that will be the death to the net zero agenda, which is very telling. So, what is the net zero agenda then for the
Well,
United
it's
States
kill
and other Western powers?
capitalism. I mean, that's always been the net zero agenda, and it's always been the whole climate change movement's agenda is to it's just a socialist movement. The whole agenda is to kill capitalism, kill economic growth, and so yeah, John Podesta, for people who may not know, used to he really created essentially back in the 90s, the Center for American Progress, this another dark money NGO that basically was the organizer of the whole fight against hydraulic fracturing and the shale revolution in the United States. So where would we be in the world had the United States not accomplished its shale revolution? We've added the equivalent of Saudi Arabia to our daily oil production just in the United States, strictly from these shale formations. And we are far and away the largest producer of natural gas and exporter of LNG on earth. And in this current crisis in the Middle East, where everybody's, lost their ability to get natural gas, LNG from Qatar, everybody's coming where? To the United States to fill in the gap. Where would the world be if the shale revolution had not succeeded? And so you look at it, it's really been the energy and economic miracle of this century so far. What we've done in just 20 years in the United States, the amount of production and reserves that have been added here is really unprecedented. And that's what these groups were fighting against. And in the meantime, what's happened to our air and water in the United States? It's gotten cleaner. In the meantime, what's happened to our emissions of CO2 and methane? They've gotten lower. Okay. None of the tactics they used, the scare language they put out against hydraulic fracturing and the shale revolution was true. It was all lies. So, now they're doing the same thing with data centers. And what the industry has to be able to adequately explain is, because this is a really good point that the opposition is raising now. Why do we need 5,000? I mean, we already have several thousand data centers, either under construction or already built in the United States. Why do we need 5,500 more? What exactly are those data centers going to do? This is a question that I see increasingly being asked now by reporters in the media and by these activists. And this industry doesn't have a good answer to that. People need to understand. You need to be able to explain why all this additional data center capacity to what we already have is really necessary. And I'm sure there's a reason. I don't doubt that there's a reason, but the industry has done a really poor job in explaining any of that. And so if you don't have good answers, you're not going to beat these activists with Mr. Wonderful, Kevin O'Leary, or it doesn't matter who you're putting out to be your front man. They're not going to be able to push back on this if you don't have good answers to legitimate questions. And right now, the industry doesn't have those answers.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Like, I think there's two issues there. One is, with respect to the using the large language models, or if you're using them for coding or creating images or asking questions or whatever, all of that takes computing power. And if lots and lots of people, if millions of people are using all of these different large language models or whatever, for whatever reason, it all requires computing power. And the more people that come on, the more compute you need. And if you're going to use it to do stuff on the moon, do things on Mars, and do things on Earth, then yes, you're going to need a lot of this computing power. But people need to understand it better than like you said, than how they've been communicating, which has been almost no communication. And then I think the other interesting thing was that last year, the Trump administration, Trump had an executive order ordering the EPA to look at finding brownfield sites that could be repurposed for data centers in order to expedite construction, to sort of relieve the pressure from using greenfield sort of developments. And so far, I think it was the EPA had identified about 335 sites, but of mixed quality, I suppose,
Yeah.
and whatnot. And so, what do you think the solution is? Could we use those brownfield sites? What about some of these abandoned office towers in some of these cities? Why not build them in these office towers? I mean, what do you think the solution is?
Yeah, Denver's apparently the test case for that theory. They've got about 70% vacancy now in the buildings in downtown Denver, and people are saying, well, why can't we put the data centers there? And that's not something I'm any kind of an expert on. When you look at the data centers that are being built, they're completely different kinds of buildings. They're all low profile, 2-3 story buildings, not 40 story skyscrapers. And to house this amount of computing power, you're going to have a certain grade of infrastructure that maybe these office towers don't possess, right? So I don't know what the technical answers to that is, but obviously there's an issue there. I do think there's got to be plenty of brownfield sites around the country, though, that can be used. But like an oil and gas operation, you have to have certain infrastructure needs being met to be successful. And I suspect the answer we're going to get back from the data center industry is that, these kinds of buildings just don't have the whatever it is, they're not the grade of infrastructure that we really need to house all this computing power. Plus, you would have to be able to ensure that you can, bear the expense and remain economic of putting in all the additional electrical lines that you're going to have to put into an office tower like that in order to power this massive energy need from all this computing power. So, I understand the concerns about that, but these are not easy answers, and I suspect the data center industry is going to have a hard time telling that story as well. It's because like oil and gas, there's no reason why the average person in America, and I'm not questioning anyone's intelligence, but the average person in America doesn't have any need in their daily lives to understand the intricate details of the oil and gas industry. And it's the same way with the data center industry. Until they're being personally impacted, they don't really have any, it's just not part of what they're thinking about from day to day. And so these things become really hard to explain to people who just don't understand the ins and outs of the industry. And I guess what I'm trying to get around to is these data center companies, if you want to get your projects built, you better start looking around for help in communications, because what you've been doing so far isn't working, and it's getting you into a big problem now.
Okay, so let's say that you had the ear of David Sachs, the AI czar in the Trump administration, or his buddies on the All In podcast. If you had their ear, what advice would you give them?
Well, I would give them just in terms of what?
In terms of how to effectively
How to fight
respond
back
to,
effectively?
yeah.
Yeah. Well, the first thing you need to do is find a really strong company advisory group that has been in these fights before. You ought to be looking for a firm that played a big role in the shale revolution, because this is the exact same fight. and that has a staff that's not just energy focused, but a wide range of expertise in its company that it can lean on to help advise you correctly. But you need to have real answers to legitimate questions and not just a bunch of canned talking points that kind of generalize things. Because, I think that's what Mr. O'Leary was trying to do initially, just until the last couple of weeks. I heard him say on more than one occasion that all of these protesters against his data center in Utah were astroturf. They were just paid activists who were bussed in. But that was only part true. Yes, there were people being bussed in to protest against that data center, but there were also a lot of legitimate people with legitimate issues and questions that weren't being answered. You've got to be able to address both things, because a half truth is no better than an outright lie in a situation like that. You've got to be open and honest and bring legitimate mitigations, legitimate solutions to legitimate problems, and not pretend it's all astroturf, because it's not. And then on the other hand, you also have to be able to fight against the astroturf and expose them, like O'Leary, to his credit, is now doing. And so it's really a multifaceted fight, and you need real strong advice from really good people. And anyone wants to get in touch with me, I have a firm I would highly recommend, and it's not me. Okay, I don't have a self-interest in it, but I know one or two firms even that were really the best in the shale fight, and could be a real help in this. And I'm sure they're both probably engaged with at least one data center company already. And but that's you've got to have help. You don't have the staff internally to deal with this battle, and if you try to do that, you're going to lose.
Good. Those are great points, and I hope someone reaches out to you, David, because that would I think they need some assistance on this issue. What do you make of Elon Musk's proposal to put data centers in space? Is that a solution?
Well, people tend to chuckle at Elon Musk when he throws things like that out, and then 2 or 3 years later, he's doing it, right? And so, my initial reaction when I first read that was, how in the world are you going to do that? And then I, realized, well, this is Elon Musk, and so he probably knows how he's going to do it. So it's probably a viable idea that's going to cost an awful lot of money. But he's shown the ability to do things that, a few years before people thought was impossible, like bring back that booster from outer space and not just land it safely without dumping it into the ocean as garbage, but having a dock at his liftoff site that actually reaches out and grabs it. Okay. 2 years before that happened, most people would have thought that's completely impossible. That's not something anyone's going to be able to achieve. And his company did it. And so I'm not a scientist, but if I heard anyone other than Elon Musk talking about it, I'd say, well, that's a harebrained scheme that's never going to happen. But it's Elon Musk, so it's probably going to happen.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting development. And once he has Starship up and running, they'd be able to put those arrays out fairly quickly. And because he already has satellite manufacturing, and he's got the Gigafactory making, all of these massive data centers on ground, he knows how to do it. So to make it for space, it seems like, that's possible. And then that would remove, I think, a lot of the issues that people have. However,
but there is something else up.
They'd make something else out. So right now, everything Canada talks about is they need sovereign. They need sovereign AI. They need sovereign data centers. They need sovereign access to the internet. Sovereign, sovereign, sovereign. And so EU is talking like that too. The UK is talking like that. So they think Musk has too much power already with X. And so if he were to have data centers in space that provide, reliable access to compute and you don't have the footprint on land, I'm sure they'll come up with, some excuse that, oh no, we can't be so dependent on Elon Musk. He's a tyrant or something.
Do
So
they have
that's,
similar concerns about Google? I mean, I hear those kinds of things and I think, well, what are you doing about Google and its anti-competitive practices? Until you can show me something on that, I can't take you seriously. I mean, really and truly.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I'm waiting for Canada to develop its own search engine or something
Right.
and mandate everyone to use it. It's kind of like, so the streaming services in Canada are taxed 5% of their revenues. That's supposed to go towards Canadian content. And they have to have a certain percentage of Canadian content on the streaming services. Well, now they've increased it to 15%. And it's like, Canadian content is bad. And now you're just forcing more and charging more money. And I don't know. I think the whole thing is absurd, but yeah, that's
God help
Canada.
us if the U.S. government ever goes down that road. Holy cow. Can't even imagine what they produce.
Yeah, PBS. Imagine all the PBS stuff. Like, to be fair, some PBS shows are okay, but some of it is pretty politically driven.
Exactly. And why does the government need to fund it? Why do taxpayers need to fund any of it? Shouldn't.
Right. But, it's interesting. It's the sort of European model and the UK model where you're kind of forced to subsidize these state television stations. And then those state stations crowd out competition. Right. And
so the government can control the message. I mean, that's
exactly
there.
Exactly. Yeah. And even right now in Canada, they subsidize media organizations. So newspapers, television, they all get money from the federal government. And you see them walking, being careful, tiptoeing around stuff, not reporting things like they would against a conservative government. So, we're interesting times.
Yeah, well, I mean, that happens in the United States too. And the Inflation Reduction Act, I mean, people didn't really focus on it, but it had a bunch of money going into media organizations too, for similar reason. And so it really diminishes the reliability of your media and your ability to trust that they're reporting the truth and the full truth, not just part of it.
Yes. Yeah. And I think that's one of the reasons why podcasts have really taken off, is people are getting information and interpretation that goes outside what you would regularly get just turning on your television.
Yeah, for sure. Anyway, it's a scary situation in that regard.
Well, thanks, David. I think we're running up at to the end of the time here, and I just want to thank you for taking time out of your morning to chat with me about this.
Always a pleasure. Absolutely. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, thanks so much. And you know what? I'll see you on Monday when we do the Energy Realities podcast.
Good deal. All right.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.